The lobby of Callaway Cosmetics was the kind of place designed to make certain people feel small. 40-foot ceilings, Italian marble floors in pale ivory and gray, a cascading chandelier of imported crystal that caught the light and threw it across every surface like scattered diamonds. The kind of architecture that didn't just impress, it intimidated. It said without a single word that the people who belonged here were a specific kind of people, and that specific kind was not the man pushing the yellow mop bucket across the far end of the hall at 20 minutes past 11 on a Tuesday night. Marcus Reed had learned a long time ago not to look at the chandelier. Not because it wasn't beautiful, it was. It was extraordinary. But a man in his position, in his uniform, with his cart and his bucket, and his institutional gray polo shirt with the cleaning service logo stitched over the left breast, did not stare at chandeliers. A man in his position kept his eyes level, kept his movements steady and efficient, and did the work. He was invisible here, and invisibility, he had come to understand, was not a weakness. It was a discipline, a choice made every single night, renewed quietly, without ceremony. He was 37 years old. His hands were calloused in the specific way that hands get when they've done hard physical work for years without complaint. Thick pads at the base of each finger, a ridge of toughened skin across his palm. His forearms were corded with muscle that had nothing to do with a gym and everything to do with loading supply trucks, lifting equipment, spending years in motion from dusk to dawn. His face was lean and serious, the kind of face that held its expression the way old timber holds its grain, quietly, deeply, shaped by forces that had long since done their work. He had dark eyes that noticed things. He had a jaw that didn't soften easily, and he had a stillness about him, when he moved through those marble halls, that some people might have mistaken for defeat. It was not defeat. Marcus Reed had never been defeated, though life had taken several sincere attempts. A man in his position kept his eyes level, kept his movements steady and efficient, and did the work. He was invisible here, and invisibility, he had come to understand, was not a weakness. He had a son, Daniel, 6 years old. A boy with enormous brown eyes and a serious little face that broke into the most extraordinary grin when something genuinely delighted him. And Daniel was genuinely delighted by things that most children walked past without seeing. A beetle moving through the grass, the pattern of frost on a cold morning window, the way certain chords in certain songs sounded like they were made of something heavier than air. Daniel was remarkable, though Marcus was careful not to say so too often or too loudly. He didn't want to raise a boy who expected the world to confirm what his father already knew. He wanted to raise a boy who earned it. Daniel was at home right now, asleep under the blue comforter with the small dinosaur print in the back bedroom of the 2-room apartment on Mercer Street that cost Marcus $1,100 a month. More than it was worth, less than he could comfortably afford. Exactly what the market demanded and what he could not argue with. The building was managed by a man named Duval, who fixed nothing promptly and raised the rent annually with the cheerful indifference of someone who had never needed to count anything. But it was safe. The neighborhood was quiet after 9. The school 3 blocks away was decent. Marcus had chosen it for those reasons, and he accepted the rest as part of the arrangement. Dolores Whitman, 61 years old, and recently retired from the post office, lived in the unit directly across the hall. She had white hair she kept pinned neatly and a disposition that combined genuine warmth with zero tolerance for nonsense, which made her, in Marcus's estimation, approximately perfect. She stayed with Daniel on the nights Marcus worked, 4 nights a week, 10 in the evening until 6 in the morning. And she refused to accept payment beyond what she called a proper Sunday dinner and none of that takeout garbage. Marcus made her brisket. She had told him 3 times that it was the best she'd had since her late husband passed, and each time she said it, there was a silence afterward that Marcus respected completely. The incident happened at 11:47. Marcus had this confirmed later by the security log, which he never saw, but which was referenced in the complaint that was filed against him, which he most certainly did see. He had been working his way through the executive corridor on the 14th floor, the one that housed the offices of the senior leadership team, and, at its far end, the private suite belonging to Vivien Callaway herself. He had cleaned this floor 41 times since starting with the service. He knew every baseboard, every corner, every place where the carpet met the marble threshold and collected a particular kind of dust that required a specific attachment on the vacuum. He was not supposed to be there when people were present. The policy was clear. Executive floors were serviced between 10:30 and midnight after all staff had departed. Tonight, a board meeting had run long. Marcus had not been informed. This was not unusual. He was rarely informed of anything that happened in the building beyond what the work order told him, which was limited to floor assignments and supply inventory. He heard the voices before he saw them. He stopped his cart, prepared to retreat to the service elevator, and wait, as he had done before. But the voices were moving toward him, not away, and they came around the corner of the corridor before he could clear the intersection. There were 5 of them, 4 men in suits, senior executives from the look of their clothes and the particular way men carry themselves when they are accustomed to a certain level of deference. And then Vivien Calloway. He had seen her before, at a distance. Everyone in the building knew who she was. Calloway Cosmetics was her inheritance and her identity, a company founded by her grandfather, built by her father, and handed to her at 26 when he died suddenly and left her in charge of 400 employees, a global distribution network, and a reputation for excellence that she had worked furiously to maintain and expand. She was 31 years old, and she looked like someone who had decided quite early that the world would accommodate her requirements. She was wearing a charcoal blazer over a cream silk blouse, and her dark hair was pulled back in a way that was severe and elegant at the same time. She was not beautiful in a soft way. She was striking, in the way that precision instruments are striking. Everything placed exactly as intended, nothing wasted, nothing apologetic. And she was speaking, rapidly and with authority, to the man at her right, and she did not slow down when she turned the corner and nearly walked directly into Marcus's cart. She stopped. She looked at the cart. She looked at Marcus. And then, in front of 4 senior executives and with the full casual authority of someone who had never once in her life considered that this moment might require anything more delicate than what she was about to deliver, she said, "Why is this here? We're not done. This needs to be gone. Can someone remove this, please? Does anyone manage these people?" The words were not shouted. They were worse than shouted. They were said the way you would speak about a piece of furniture that had been placed inconveniently, without anger, without malice, and without the slightest acknowledgement that the object being discussed was a human being who was standing 3 feet away and could hear every syllable. One of the executives made a small gesture toward Marcus, a flick of his wrist, the kind of motion you use to shoo something, and said, "Get this out of the way." Marcus looked at the man, then at Vivien Calloway. He held his expression completely still. He gripped the handle of his cart, turned it, and wheeled it back toward the service elevator without a word. He did not hurry. He did not apologize. He pressed the elevator button and waited. Behind him, he heard Vivien Calloway resume her conversation as though nothing had occurred. He heard laughter. One of the executives, a light and social sound responding to something she had said. Marcus stood in front of the elevator doors and looked at his reflection in the brushed steel surface. He was calm. He had practiced calm for years, had built it the way he built everything, slowly, with intention from the inside out. His jaw was set. His breathing was steady. His hands, both wrapped around the cart handle, were absolutely still. But in the center of his chest, in that place where pride lives, that quiet, private, non-negotiable place that no man of any integrity can afford to have destroyed, something had shifted. Not broken, not collapsed. Shifted, tightened. The way a fist tightens before it remembers that it is not supposed to be a fist right now. The elevator arrived. Marcus wheeled his cart inside. The doors closed. He thought about Daniel, asleep under the dinosaur comforter. He thought about the Sunday brisket and Dolores Whitman's silence after she mentioned her husband. He thought about the $1,100 a month and the 3 blocks to the decent school. He thought about a long time ago and a different version of himself, and the things that version had known how to do that this version never spoke about. He thought about all of it quietly in the descending elevator, and somewhere in that thinking, something that had been sleeping for a very long time opened one eye. The mornings after the night shifts had a specific texture that Marcus had grown to know the way a man knows the weather in his own body. Before the thermometer, before the window, before any external evidence, he would come through the apartment door at 6:15, move through the dark living room without turning on any lights, and stand for a moment in the kitchen, with his hands on the counter and his eyes closed. Not sleeping, not resting, just allowing the transition. From the building to here. From invisibility to the only place in the world where he was entirely, undeniably present. At 6:45, Daniel would come out of the back bedroom in the faded green pajamas with the rocket ships, his hair standing in 3 different directions, his eyes still half assembled, carrying the specific gravity of a 6-year-old who is not yet fully committed to being awake. He would locate Marcus in the kitchen with the unerring accuracy of a creature who had learned to find one particular person in any room, and he would walk directly to him and push his face against Marcus's ribs and stay there for a moment without speaking, the way a compass needle settles after it's been moved. Marcus would put his hand on the back of Daniel's head. He wouldn't say anything either. They had built this ritual together without discussing it, the way certain things get built between people who trust each other deeply enough not to require language for everything. Then Daniel would say, "Did anything happen?" And Marcus would say, "Not much." And that would be the end of it, and they would make breakfast. Eggs, usually. Toast. Orange juice that Marcus bought in the large containers because Daniel went through it at an alarming rate that his pediatrician had confirmed was perfectly normal for his age and activity level, which had relieved Marcus considerably the first time he'd heard it. He had a tendency, which he monitored carefully, to worry about Daniel in ways that were probably excessive. He knew this. He allowed himself the worry anyway, privately, as a kind of tax on loving someone that much. He would push his face against Marcus's ribs and stay there for a moment without speaking. The way a compass needle settles after it's been moved. The morning after the incident in the executive corridor, Marcus made the eggs and the toast and the orange juice, and he sat across from Daniel at the small table by the window, and he watched his son eat with the cheerful, systematic thoroughness that characterized everything Daniel did. And he thought, this is what it is for. All of it. The cart and the bucket and the marble floors and the men in suits who flick their wrists. All of it is for this table, this boy, this morning, this exact and ordinary and irreplaceable moment. He had thought this thought before many times. It never lost its weight. It never became routine. If anything, it got heavier with repetition the way certain truths do. Daniel looked up and said, "You look tired." He said it matter-of-factly, as an observation, not a complaint. He was a perceptive child, and he had learned very early to name what he saw rather than pretend he hadn't seen it. "I'm okay," Marcus said. "Did something bad happen at work?" Marcus looked at his son for a moment. 6 years old, those enormous brown eyes that didn't miss much. "No," he said. "Just a long night." Daniel nodded and returned to his eggs with the seriousness of someone who had accepted an answer while remaining open to a revision at a later date. Marcus loved this quality in him more than he knew how to say. The complaint was delivered through the cleaning service management 3 days later. Marcus was called into the office of Gerald Finch, the operations supervisor, a heavy-set man in his late 50s who wore the same gray cardigan every time Marcus had ever seen him, and who managed his small staff with the joyless efficiency of someone who had stopped expecting the work to be interesting many years ago. Finch had a printed sheet on his desk. He looked at it, then at Marcus, then back at the sheet. "Executive floor incident," he said. "Tuesday, Miss Calloway's office flagged a disruption. Said your equipment was blocking a business corridor during active business hours." He looked up. "You know the policy on that." "The meeting ran long," Marcus said. "I wasn't notified." "Doesn't matter. You're responsible for checking the evening schedule." The schedule showed the floor clear at 10:30. The meeting wasn't on the shared calendar. Finch tapped the printed sheet. "That's not what the report says." Marcus was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that a less composed man might have filled with words he would later regret. "What does the report say?" "Says you were unresponsive to direction, that you needed to be told twice to move your equipment. Finch shifted in his chair. Look, Marcus, you're one of my best workers. You know that. I'm not trying to cause you trouble, but she runs a significant account for us, and when she sends something to management, I have to respond to it. He paused. Written warning. Goes in the file, that's all. A written warning, Marcus repeated. Not a question, just the words, held up in the light for a moment, examined for what they actually were. That's all, Finch said again, which was his way of indicating that the conversation was finished. Marcus picked up the pen on Finch's desk, signed the form, set the pen back down, and left the office. In the hallway, he stood for a moment with one hand flat against the painted concrete wall. Not because he needed the support, because the wall was there and solid and cool, and sometimes that is enough. What Marcus never told anyone, not Dolores Whitman, not the few people he could have called friends if his life had allowed him more time for friendship, was that the cleaning job was not the first difficult thing he had endured with silence. It was not even in the top 5. He had a capacity for absorbing hardship that went well beyond what his current circumstances required, which was both a resource and a burden depending on the day. He had grown up in Galveston, Texas, in a neighborhood where dignity was something you constructed privately and defended without display, because display attracted attention, and attention attracted the wrong things. His father had been a decent man broken by a decade of bad choices and worse luck, and his mother had been a woman of extraordinary quiet strength, who died of a heart condition when Marcus was 19, and had never once, in his hearing, complained about a single thing her life had placed in front of her. He had inherited her silence and her stubbornness, and he had tried in the years since to make sure he had also inherited her decency. He had joined the military at 20, in part because it was available and in part because something in him had needed, urgently, a structure to test itself against. What followed was 8 years that he did not discuss in detail, in places he did not name in casual conversation, doing work that required skills that were not listed on any public employment record. He had been good at it, very good, in the specific way that people sometimes discover abilities in extreme circumstances that they could not have predicted in ordinary ones. He had also been damaged by it, in the specific way that such work damages people, quietly and thoroughly and in ways that don't always surface immediately. He left the service at 28. Within a year, he met a woman named Renata who was quick and funny and full of a brightness that he found disarming after years of moving through shadows. They were married quickly. Daniel arrived a year later. And then Renata left, not dramatically, not cruelly, but with a clear-eyed honesty that Marcus had eventually come to respect, even as it destroyed him. She had told him she could not live beside someone who carried what he carried, that she loved him and could not stay, that she hoped he would find a way through it. He had been finding a way through it ever since. Daniel was 6 years old. The apartment on Mercer Street cost $1,100 a month. The cleaning service paid $14 an hour plus a small differential for overnight shifts. Marcus did the math every month precisely and without self-pity. And he arranged things accordingly. He had a small savings account. He had a plan for Daniel's education that required the savings account to grow at a rate it was currently not quite achieving. He was working on that. In the drawer of his bedside table, beneath his passport and the small notebook where he tracked his monthly expenses, there was an old photograph. It was creased and slightly faded. It showed a younger version of Marcus, perhaps 24, 25, in a different kind of uniform, in a different kind of place, surrounded by men who held themselves with the particular posture of people who have been tested in ways that don't translate into ordinary life. Marcus was not smiling in the photograph. He was looking at something outside the frame with an expression of total composed focus that was nothing like the expression he wore in the hallways of Callaway Cosmetics. Daniel had seen the photograph once, when he was 4, during a period when he had been going through everything in the apartment with the systematic curiosity of a very small archaeologist. He had looked at it for a long time and then looked up at Marcus and said with great seriousness, "Is that you, Dad?" And Marcus had said yes. And Daniel had studied the photograph again and said, "You look different." And Marcus had said, "That was a long time ago. and Daniel had accepted this and moved on to the next discovery. What Marcus had not said, what he would not say for a very long time, was that the man in the photograph was not simply a different version of himself. He was a different category of person entirely. And that category had never fully gone away. It had only gone quiet. And sometimes in the right circumstances, or the wrong ones, quiet things wake up. 3 weeks after the incident in the corridor, on a Friday night in November when the rain had been coming down steadily since mid-afternoon, and the streets around the Callaway building were slick and dark and nearly empty, Marcus arrived for his shift to find the building quieter than usual. The receptionist who normally occupied the security desk, a young man named Kevin, who always nodded at Marcus in a way that was neither friendly nor unfriendly, but was at least consistent, had been replaced by a contract security guard who did not acknowledge Marcus at all when he badged in, which was fine. Marcus had long since stopped measuring his worth in the acknowledgments of strangers. He collected his supplies from the service corridor, loaded his cart, and took the freight elevator to the 3rd floor. He worked methodically, as always. The offices on the 3rd floor housed the marketing and creative departments, open-plan space full of standing desks and gallery walls covered in campaign materials, color swatches, and the kind of inspirational typography that Marcus suspected cost more to frame than he earned in a month. He did not resent this. He had stopped being surprised by the economics of certain industries a long time ago. He moved through the space with his mop and his cart, and the quiet efficiency of someone who has internalized the geography of a place completely, who can navigate it in the dark if necessary. By the time he reached the 14th floor, executive territory, it was after 1 in the morning. He had been careful this time to check the room booking system on the tablet mounted in the service corridor, which showed the floor officially clear since 9 p.m. He had also checked twice. He was not going to receive another written warning for someone else's failure to update a calendar. The corridor was dark, except for the emergency lighting strips along the baseboard and the ambient glow from the city outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. Marcus moved through it without turning on the overhead lights, which was both his preference and the standard protocol for minimizing disruption to the building's after-hours systems. He knew this floor the way he knew his apartment. The distance between doorways, the faint sound the HVAC made when it cycled, the particular way sound traveled here, which was differently from the lower floors because of the ceiling height and the acoustic paneling, which was why he heard it. A sound that didn't belong, not mechanical, not the building's routine breath, something quieter and more human than that. He stopped his cart at the intersection of the main corridor and the short hallway that led to the executive suite. He stood still and listened with the attentiveness of someone for whom listening had once been a professional skill of the highest order. The sound came again, from behind the closed door of Vivien Callaway's private office. Low. Not words, just the compressed, controlled sound of someone trying very hard not to be heard. The sound came again. Not words. Just the compressed, controlled sound of someone trying very hard not to be heard. Marcus knew that sound. He had made it himself in various dark rooms over various years. Marcus knew that sound. He had made it himself in various dark rooms over various years. He stood in the hallway for a long moment, debating. The smart move. The invisible move. The move that protected his employment and his $1,100 a month apartment and his son sleeping under the dinosaur comforter was to continue past. Take his cart to the north end of the floor and let whatever was happening behind that door remain private and unacknowledged. The way certain things that happen in office buildings after midnight are supposed to remain. He took 3 steps toward the north end. Then he stopped again. He stood in the corridor for a moment longer. Then he turned around, walked back to the office door and knocked. 2 knocks. Quiet and even. Silence. Then, "Who's there?" "Building maintenance," Marcus said, which was approximately true. A pause. Then the sound of a chair moving. Then the door opened, and Vivien Callaway stood in it. She was wearing the same kind of clothes she wore during business hours, a dark blouse, tailored pants, but her hair was down, and her face was different from every other time Marcus had seen it. The authority was still there, the precision, the composed jawline. But something underneath all of that had slipped. The way a mask slips not because it fails but because the person behind it is simply too tired to hold it perfectly in place. Her eyes were red at the edges. Her expression, when she registered who was standing at her door, moved through surprise and into something that looked very much like the beginning of renewed control, the automatic reassembly of the professional exterior. She opened her mouth. He expected something like Tuesday's corridor, the casual dismissal, the absent authority. Instead, she said nothing for a moment. She looked at him with an expression he hadn't seen from her before, an expression that wasn't performing anything. "I'm sorry," she said. And then, as though hearing herself say it to a cleaning worker at 1:15 in the morning, had made something real that had previously been theoretical. I'm fine, thank you." She started to close the door. "Miss Calloway," Marcus said, not loudly, just clearly. She stopped. The door was half closed. She looked at him through the gap. "You don't have to be fine," he said. "It's 1 in the morning. Nobody's grading you right now." She did not invite him in immediately. She stood in the half-open door for a long moment, and in that moment Marcus could see her negotiating with herself. The part that knew who she was and what was appropriate, and what the power differential between them was supposed to require of her, against the part that was simply a person in a dark office after midnight who had been crying, and had not done so in front of anyone for longer than she could clearly remember. The second part won. The door opened fully. She walked back to her desk and sat down, and Marcus stepped inside, leaving his cart in the hall. The office was large and meticulously organized, which he had expected. What he had not expected was the shelf along the east wall, which held not awards or plaques or the standard corporate architecture of achievement, but books, actual books, red books, some with broken spines and folded corners, and a small framed photograph of a much older woman with bright eyes, who bore a faint resemblance to Vivien, and a child's drawing, rendered in crayon, of a figure that might have been a butterfly or a woman in a red dress, which was taped directly to the wall with no frame at all, which struck Marcus as the most honest thing in the room. He did not sit. He stood near the door with his hands at his sides, easy and present, the way he stood when he was waiting and watching, and not needing to fill the silence with himself. Vivien Calloway said, "You were here that night, 3 weeks ago, when I—" She stopped, started again. "I said something about your equipment in front of my team." "Yes," Marcus said. "I didn't—" Another stop. Her jaw tightened slightly. "That was not how I should have spoken, I know that." "Okay," Marcus said. She looked at him. "That's it? Okay. What else would you like me to say?" She seemed to consider this. "Most people would either accept it very enthusiastically or tell me I was terrible. Most people in my position would be very worried about keeping their job," Marcus said. "But I'm not most people. And this isn't most hours." She looked at him again with that expression, the one without the mask. "What is your name?" "Marcus. Marcus Reed." "Marcus." She said his name like she was testing it. I don't have anyone in the building this late. I had a call. Europe, it went bad. It went..." And then she stopped again, and this time the stop was different, not a decision to speak more carefully. A genuine run out of words, which Marcus suspected was not something Vivien Calloway experienced often. "I just couldn't make myself leave." Marcus nodded. He understood about not being able to make yourself leave a place, about how a building can become a container for the version of yourself you know how to be, and how stepping outside it means becoming the version you're less certain of. They were quiet for a moment. The rain moved against the windows with a sound like static. Outside, 40 feet below, a cab moved through the wet street and disappeared. Then Vivien Calloway said something that she had clearly not planned to say, had probably not known she was going to say until she was already saying it, and which landed in the room between them with the peculiar weight of completely unguarded truth. "Would you stay for a little while? You don't have to. I know it's strange. I know you're working." I just... She stopped. The composure held, just barely. I don't have anyone to call. I realized that tonight. I went through my phone and I didn't. There isn't anyone. Marcus looked at her for a long moment. The most powerful person in the building, sitting behind her enormous clean desk at 1:30 in the morning in the dark, telling the cleaning man that she had no one to call. He thought about dignity and what forms it could take, and how sometimes the most dignified thing a person could do was be exactly honest about what they needed without pretending they didn't need it. He thought about his son. He thought about the photograph in the bedside drawer. He thought about a version of himself that was very quiet and very still, and that he had been managing carefully for a long time. I can stay for a while, he said. He pulled a chair from along the wall, set at a respectful distance from her desk, and sat down. And in that dark office with the rain against the glass and the city below them, indifferent and glittering, two people who had almost nothing in common began, slowly and without any plan whatsoever, to talk. What neither of them knew, yet, was that this conversation was going to change everything, not just for them, for everyone who thought they understood who Marcus Reed was. Everyone who had ever looked at him and seen only the cart, and the uniform, and the floor. They talked until 3:15 in the morning. Marcus could not have told you afterward exactly how it had happened. The arc of it, the specific point at which two people who had no reason to speak honestly to each other began doing exactly that. It happened the way certain things happen between strangers in the middle of the night, when the ordinary rules of who you are supposed to be to each other have been suspended by exhaustion and darkness, and the specific kind of honesty that a person sometimes arrives at when they have nothing left to perform. Vivien Calloway talked about her father, about the company he had left her, and the way inheriting something enormous from someone you loved and were terrified of in equal measure had complicated every single year of her adult life. About the board members who smiled at her in meetings and questioned her decisions in private. About the loneliness that had arrived so gradually she hadn't noticed it until it was simply the texture of everything. Marcus listened. He was a very good listener, not in the polite, nodding way of someone waiting for their turn, but in the deep, attentive way of someone for whom listening had once been the difference between one outcome and another. He asked two questions the entire time. Both were small questions. The kind that don't announce themselves as significant, but that open something in the person being asked. She answered both questions, and then looked at him afterward with an expression that was very close to surprise, as though she had said more than she'd intended and hadn't minded. Marcus did not share much of himself that night. He was not ready for that, and he knew it. He shared small things. The breakfast ritual with Daniel, the way Dolores Whitman talked about her late husband, the fact that he tracked his monthly expenses in a small notebook, because the act of writing numbers down made them feel manageable in a way that a phone screen did not. He shared these things in the precise proportion that the moment seemed to require, no more, and Vivien Calloway received them with a quality of attention that he had not expected from her. She was sharper than he had assumed, not just intelligent in the professional, data-driven way of people trained to move companies forward, but genuinely perceptive, the kind of perceptive that comes from having watched people carefully for a long time, even if you haven't always been kind about what you've seen. He was a very good listener, not in the polite, nodding way of someone waiting for their turn, but in the deep, attentive way of someone for whom listening had once been the difference between one outcome and another. At 3:15, she said, "You should go. You have a son at home." And he said yes, and stood. And they stood for a moment in the office that was lit only by the desk lamp and the ambient glow of the city, and neither of them said anything that acknowledged what had just happened, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. He collected his cart from the hall and finished the north end of the floor, and he left the building at 4:30 and drove home in the dark through streets made clean and empty by the rain, and he sat in his car in front of his building for several minutes before going in. He was thinking about resistance. Specifically, about the kind of resistance a man exercises not against enemies but against himself, against the parts of himself that want things he cannot afford to want, that feel things that complicate the clean and necessary architecture of a life built entirely around keeping one small boy safe and loved and unbroken. Marcus had built that architecture carefully, deliberately, brick by brick, over 6 years. It was the most important structure he had ever constructed. It was also, he recognized in the honesty of 4:30 in the morning, extremely lonely. He was not a man who permitted himself self-pity, but he was a man honest enough to name a thing when he saw it. And what he saw, sitting in his car in the rain, was a version of himself that had been alone for a very long time and had become so skilled at managing that aloneness that he had nearly stopped noticing it. Nearly. The weeks that followed were strange. Marcus continued his shifts. He continued to clean the executive floor on the assigned nights because it was his assignment and because he was not the kind of man who changed his behavior based on a single unusual evening. He did not seek out Vivien Calloway. He did not linger near her office. He did his work and he moved through the building the way he always had, efficiently, quietly, without display. But she found him, not dramatically, not in any way that required a scene or an explanation. She simply appeared in the service corridor one evening as he was loading his cart, wearing her coat clearly on her way out of the building, and she said, "Daniel, how is he?" And Marcus, who had not expected to be asked that question by this person in this place, took a moment before answering. "He's good," he said. "He drew a picture of a horse yesterday. He was very disappointed that it looked like a dog." Vivien Calloway looked at him for a moment, and then she laughed. A real laugh, quick and unguarded, nothing like her professional smile. And she said, "Tell him horses are harder than they look." And then she left. That was all. But it was not nothing. Marcus recognized that very clearly. The situation with his employment, however, was not improving. Gerald Finch called him in again, 3 weeks after the written warning. There had been a second complaint. Not about a specific incident, but a general one. A request from the Calloway account to reassign the overnight crew on the executive floors. The request had come through official channels and been phrased in careful corporate language, but its meaning was plain. Someone wanted Marcus out of that building. Finch, to his credit, was uncomfortable delivering this. He looked at his desk more than he looked at Marcus. He said the company valued Marcus's work. He said he was going to try to find a comparable assignment. He said he was sorry. Marcus looked at the man who was sorry and thought about what sorry cost a person and what it changed. He thought about Daniel's school, 3 blocks from the apartment. He thought about the savings account and its current balance and the rate at which it was not growing. He thought about the photograph in the bedside drawer and the version of himself in that photograph who would have processed this information very differently. Not with resignation, not with suppressed anger, but with the cold, methodical clarity of someone who understood that every problem has a geometry, and that if you can see the geometry, you can find the solution. He thanked Finch. He walked out. In the parking lot, he sat on a concrete barrier and looked at the sky for a long time. The sky was the color of old pewter, low and uniform. He thought about honor, about what it means to be a good man in a world that frequently does not reward goodness and sometimes actively punishes it. About his mother's silence and his father's broken choices in the 8 years of service and the photograph, and Renata leaving, and Daniel's laugh, and $1,100 a month, and the notebook with the numbers in it, and Vivien Calloway saying, "Tell him horses are harder than they look," and the way something in him had shifted when she said it. Like a door opening slightly onto a room he had sealed a long time ago for reasons that had once been very clear and were currently somewhat less so. He took out his phone. He looked at a contact he had not called in 4 years. A man named Theodore Branch, who was currently the director of security operations for a firm that did work Marcus understood very well, in the specific way that only certain people understand certain kinds of work. Branch had called him twice in the past 2 years. Marcus had not returned either call. He stared at the name now. He put the phone in his pocket. He drove to pick up Daniel from school and sat in the line for 22 minutes. And when Daniel came through the double doors and saw the car, his face broke into the grin that Marcus had spent 6 years engineering. That particular, unguarded joy that belongs only to children who have never once doubted that someone will be there. They drove home. Daniel told him about a salamander named possibly Gerald that a boy in his class had brought in a jar. Marcus listened with the full attention he always gave, and it cost him nothing, and it was the most valuable thing he did all day. That night, after Daniel was in bed, Marcus sat at the kitchen table with the notebook open. He looked at the numbers for a long time, not calculating, not solving, just looking. The way you look at something you have been managing for so long that you have confused the management with the destination. He had been surviving. He had been, in some essential way, confusing survival with living. The distinction had not troubled him for years. It troubled him now. He thought about the written warning in Gerald Finch's file. He thought about the reassignment that was coming, the quiet, corporate, consequence-free dismantling of something he had built carefully and maintained at considerable personal cost. He thought about what it meant that a woman who had never once looked at him as a full person could, from the comfortable elevation of her power, reach down and rearrange the architecture of his livelihood with a complaint filed through proper channels. No malice required, no awareness required, just the casual exercise of a power she did not have to think about, directed at a man whose existence she did not have to consider. He had endured worse. He knew that clearly. He had endured things in places with no Italian marble and no crystal chandeliers that Gerald Finch could not have survived 20 minutes of. He had endured loss that had nothing to do with employment files. He had endured a marriage that ended honestly, and a solitude that was not always chosen. He had endured all of it without complaint, without spectacle, without asking anyone for anything beyond what the work entitled him to. He had done this because it was the right way to conduct himself, because his son was watching, because dignity, he had always believed, was not a reward for easy circumstances. It was what you maintained in hard ones. He did not call. Not yet. But for the first time in a very long time, he did not put the phone away immediately. He held it in his hand and looked at Theodore Branch's name in the gray November light. And he thought about geometry, about the shape of a problem that was not just financial, not just professional, but something larger and older and more fundamental than either of those things. He thought about what a man is willing to endure for the right reasons, and what a man owes himself when the endurance has gone on long enough. And he thought, not yet, but soon. It was Daniel who made it happen. Not intentionally. He was 6 years old, and 6-year-olds do not orchestrate things so much as they inhabit the world with a completeness that occasionally produces outcomes adults could not have engineered deliberately. He had been sick with a winter cold, the ordinary runny-nosed, low-fever variety that children accumulate with the resigned efficiency of small biological research stations, and Dolores Whitman had called Marcus at 10 in the evening to say that Daniel was asking for him and was not settling, and Marcus had told his supervisor he had a family emergency and left. The complication was that Vivien Calloway had been in the building, a late session with her overseas distribution partners. She had seen Marcus's supervisor, a man named Garrett, who managed the evening cruise with a cheerfulness inversely proportional to his understanding of the people who worked for him, and Garrett had said, in the particular tone of someone who considers himself to be sharing useful information, that Reed had left early, which was unusual, family thing with the kid, which was why the 14th floor was going to run behind tonight. Vivien had said nothing to this. She had gone back to her meeting. But something in that information had stayed with her the way small facts sometimes stay with people who are, underneath their professional architecture, paying very close attention to things they have not yet admitted they are paying attention to. The next morning she had done something she had never done in her professional life in relation to a member of the building's service staff. She had asked her executive assistant, a precise and unflappable woman named Marion, to find out what she could about Marcus Reed. Marion, who had worked for Vivien for 6 years, and who had seen her do a great many things but not this, had done so without comment and had placed a folder on Vivien's desk by mid-afternoon. What Marion had assembled was thin, because Marcus Reed was the kind of man who moved through the official record the way he moved through buildings, efficiently, leaving very little trace. What Marion had assembled was thin, because Marcus Reed was the kind of man who moved through the official record the way he moved through buildings, efficiently, leaving very little trace. Employment history with the cleaning service, clean record, highest performance ratings available within the company's internal system. Prior employment. A period of federal service, the nature of which was listed only as Government Contractor Classified Operations Division, which was a phrase that meant something very specific to people who knew what it meant. Prior to that, military service 8 years, honorably discharged, unit and operational details restricted. Educational background, 1 year of college, interrupted. Prior to interruption, high school in Galveston, Texas, where his academic record showed a student of exceptional aptitude who had tested in the 97th percentile nationally and had been offered a partial academic scholarship to a university he had never attended. Vivien read this folder 3 times. Then she made a call. The call was to a man she knew through her father, a retired intelligence professional named Harmon, who had consulted for the family on security matters for years and who had, during those years, come to know a great many things about a great many people. She described what she had: the military service, the restricted unit, the classified contractor work. She asked if he could tell her anything more. Harmon was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What's the name?" She gave it. Another silence. Longer. Then, "Where did you meet this man?" She told him. He was quiet again. Then he said carefully, in the way that careful people phrase things when they want to be accurate without being reckless, "Miss Calloway, the man you are describing was, for approximately 5 years, one of the most effective close protection and threat assessment operatives in a program that officially does not exist. I knew 3 people who worked with him. All 3 of them said the same thing about Marcus Reed. They said he was the best they had ever seen. They also said he walked away from it at the height of his capability, which almost nobody does, and that he did so for personal reasons that were never entirely clear to anyone in the program. I would suggest that if this man is currently mopping floors in your building, you are perhaps underutilizing the resources available to you." He paused. "And I would suggest you treat him accordingly." Vivien put the phone down. She sat at her desk for a long time. Outside her window, the city moved in its ordinary and oblivious way. Millions of people going about the business of their lives with no awareness of the particular weight that had just settled into this particular room. She thought about the corridor. 3 months ago. She thought about the way she had spoken. She thought about the wrist flick of the executive beside her and the way Marcus Reed had looked at him. Not with anger. Not with submission. But with a stillness that she had registered at the time as resignation and was now understanding. With a clarity that arrived like a cold wind, was something else entirely. It was restraint. The specific, deliberate, costly restraint of a man who knows exactly what he is capable of and has chosen, for reasons of his own, not to use it. The record. What the file said. 8 years of service in a unit whose operational history remains classified to this day. Fluent in 3 languages, certified in advanced threat assessment, close protection operations, and what the file referred to only as specialized interdiction. Deployed across 4 continents. Commended twice. Offered a promotion to a senior role he declined. Walked away at 31 with an honorable discharge and no public explanation. The man who had been mopping her floors was not a man who had failed to find better work. He was a man who had chosen deliberately and at significant cost to build a different life, a smaller life, a quieter life, because he had something more important to protect than his career or his status or his salary. He had a 6-year-old boy with enormous brown eyes who liked orange juice and drew horses that looked like dogs. She went to find him that evening. He was on the 3rd floor marketing department working the south corridor with his usual unhurried precision. She stood at the end of the corridor for a moment before he heard her, or before he let her know he heard her, which she now understood were not necessarily the same thing. And then he looked up from his work and saw her and waited. She walked toward him. She stopped several feet away, which felt important, as though she wanted to be standing at a respectful distance, rather than in the authority position she usually occupied. She said, "I know who you are." Marcus looked at her with an expression she could not quite read. "I'm the person who cleans your building," he said. "You know that's not what I mean." He was quiet for a moment. "What do you want, Miss Calloway?" "I want to understand why," she said. "You could be—" She stopped. "You don't have to be doing this." Marcus set down the handle of his mop, with a deliberateness that was not aggressive but that was very clear. He looked at her directly, the way he had not permitted himself to look at her in the months of corridors and carts and careful invisibility. And he said, in a voice that was entirely calm and entirely without apology, "My son is 6 years old. He needs me present, not deployed. He needs me home in the morning. Me. Not on a plane. He needs stability and safety and a father who shows up, not a father who is good at a job that requires him to be everywhere except where his son is. I chose this. I chose it completely, and I would choose it again every single time." He paused. "That is why." Vivien Calloway stood in the corridor of her own building and felt something she was not accustomed to feeling in professional contexts. It took her a moment to identify it accurately. It was shame, not dramatic, not crushing, but real. The specific shame of having looked at a person for months and seen only their category, and of understanding, finally, how much she had missed, and what that missing had cost both of them. "I owe you more than an apology," she said. "You don't owe me anything," Marcus said. "But I'll accept the apology." She nodded. And then, because she was a woman who had learned, in 31 years of navigating a world that underestimated her constantly, that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply ask, "Would you consider a different arrangement? Something that actually uses what you are?" She held his gaze. "Not as a favor, as a business proposition. Because my current head of security is retiring in 6 weeks, and I have just learned that the best man for the job has been cleaning my lobby for the past 4 months. She paused. "And I would very much like to correct that error." He did not say yes that night. He said he would think about it, which was the honest answer and the only one he was willing to give in a corridor at 9:30 in the evening with a mop in his hand, and a heart that was moving faster than he was going to show. He drove home. He made himself a cup of coffee that he did not drink. He sat at the kitchen table with the notebook of monthly expenses open in front of him, and he looked at the numbers, which he had looked at every month for years, and he let himself see them differently for the first time, not as the floor he was standing on, as the ceiling he was pressing against. He went to the bedside drawer. He took out the photograph. He had not held it in a long time. He kept it there as a reminder, not as a comfort, as a record of a self he had set down, not as a self he wanted to return to. He looked at the younger man's face, the total composed focus of someone who is very good at something that cost him a great deal. He put the photograph back. He walked down the short hall to Daniel's room and opened the door quietly and stood there in the dark, listening to his son breathe. Daniel was on his back, one arm flung out at the angle that children sleep, the dinosaur comforter half fallen to the floor. His face in sleep was open and unguarded and absolutely trusting, with the particular peace of a child who has never once had reason to doubt that he will be safe and found. Marcus had worked every day of Daniel's life to produce exactly that face, that specific quality of rest, that trust. It was the most precise and important work he had ever done. It was also not finished. It would not be finished for a long time. He pulled the comforter back up. He stood there another moment. Then he went to bed. He called Theodore Branch the next morning, after Daniel left for school. Branch picked up on the second ring, which meant he had been waiting. Marcus said, "I need a consultation." "Not a job, a consultation." Branch said, "Marcus." Finally. They talked for 40 minutes. Marcus asked specific questions about what a transition back into high-level security work looked like. Not field work, not deployment, but director-level operations management. The kind of work that happens from a desk and a strategy room and a team. The kind that doesn't require a man to vanish from his son's life. Branch said that kind of work existed and paid accordingly. Marcus asked what accordingly looked like. Branch told him. Marcus said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "All right." Branch said, "All right what?" Marcus said, "All right. I'm ready to stop pretending that what I am is only worth $14 an hour." Branch laughed. It was a long and genuinely delighted laugh, the laugh of a man who had been waiting 4 years to hear exactly those words. Marcus met with Vivien Calloway the following Thursday. Not in a corridor. Not in a building she owned at an hour nobody was watching. In a conference room at 11 in the morning with the formal dignity the situation required. He had worn the one suit he owned, dark charcoal, well cut, bought years ago and maintained carefully, because Marcus Reed had never been the kind of man who dressed for where he was. He had always dressed for what he was. Vivien Calloway sat across from him with Marion beside her and a folder open on the table. And for the first time in all the months of their acquaintance, she was the one who seemed slightly off her usual footing. Not nervous. Just aware, with the heightened awareness of someone who now understood what was sitting across the table from her. He had always dressed for what he was, not where he was. And what he was had never changed. It had only gone quiet for a while. They talked for 2 hours. The terms were clear, reasonable, and significantly better than anything Marcus had permitted himself to imagine during the years of notebooks and monthly calculations. He asked 3 questions, all of them about the operational parameters of the role. The reporting structure, the scope of authority, the flexibility of schedule as it pertained to school pickups and sick days, and a 6-year-old who had not yet learned that horses are harder than they look. Vivien answered each question directly and without hesitation, which told him something important about her that the corridor version of her had kept hidden. She had been shaped, partly, by years of people underestimating her. She knew something about that, and now she knew something about him, and the space between those two knowings was, Marcus thought, the beginning of something that could be built on. He signed the offer letter at 1:15. Marion produced a pen. Marcus took it and signed his name the same way he did everything, without drama, with complete intention. He set the pen down and looked at the paper for a moment, at his own name in his own handwriting on a document that said in the formal language of contracts that he was worth what he had always been worth, that the cleaning service polo and the freight elevator and the written warning in Gerald Finch's file were not the definition of him, had never been the definition of him, had been, at most, the circumstances he had chosen to live inside for a season that was now ending. Marion collected the papers. Vivien Calloway looked across the table at him with the expression of someone who has done something they are not yet sure they understand the full weight of. "You're not going to tell me I should have found you sooner," she said. It was not quite a question. Marcus looked at her steadily. "You found me when you were supposed to," he said. "Some things take the time they take." She considered this. "That's a very patient way to look at it." He said, "I have a 6-year-old. You develop patience or you don't survive." She looked at him for one more moment. That look without the mask. The one he had first seen in the rainy night office, and that had not fully gone away since. "Thank you," she said. Not for the meeting. Not for the signed paper. For something larger that neither of them named, because some things are more accurately communicated in silence than in words, and both of them knew that. He told Daniel that evening. He sat him down at the kitchen table with orange juice and the seriousness of a father who believes that a 6-year-old deserves to be told the truth in terms he can understand. He said, "Dad is going to have a new job. A different job. I'm going to be in charge of making sure people are safe." Daniel considered this. "Like a superhero?" Marcus said, "No, like a person who is good at something and uses it." Daniel thought about this for a moment. Then he said, "Is it because of the lady with the company?" Marcus looked at his son. "What do you know about a lady with a company?" Daniel said, "Mrs. Whitman said there's a lady at your work who's important. She said you were kind to her when she was sad." Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Mrs. Whitman talks too much." Daniel grinned. That full and extraordinary grin, the one that arrived like weather. "She said you were kind," Daniel repeated, with the emphasis of a child who wants to make sure the important part has been heard. "She said that's the thing about you, Dad. You're always kind." Marcus looked at his son for a long time. The kitchen was warm. The orange juice was in the big container. Outside, 3 blocks away, there was a school that was decent. that Daniel walked to every morning with his backpack and his seriousness and his enormous eyes that didn't miss much. The apartment cost $1,100 a month and was managed by a man named Duval who fixed nothing promptly. None of that was going to change immediately. Some of it was going to change soon. But right now, at this table, with this boy, it was simply the world, the specific and irreplaceable world that Marcus had built. Piece by piece, dollar by dollar, year by year, out of nothing but work and love and a determination that nobody who had ever looked at him and seen only the cart and the uniform had come close to understanding. He reached across the table and put his hand on the back of Daniel's head, the way he did every morning in the dark. Daniel leaned into it the way he always did. "Yeah," Marcus said. "I try to be." They sat there a little longer than they needed to, in the way that certain evenings have a quality of completeness that makes you reluctant to move through them too quickly. The apartment was warm. The orange juice container stood on the table between them. In the hall, the light from Dolores Whitman's television moved faintly under the crack of the front door, which meant she was up late again with her crime procedurals that she watched with the critical attention of a retired federal prosecutor. Daniel had finished his juice and was now engaged in a careful and unprompted reorganization of the paper napkins on the table, which was the thing he did when he was content and had run out of specific things to say, but wasn't ready to stop being present. Marcus watched him do this. He watched the small hands arrange and rearrange the napkins with a 6-year-old's version of deliberateness. He thought about all the mornings of the past 4 years, the dark arrivals, the eggs and toast, the compass needle ritual of the face against the ribs. He thought about what it had taken to hold all of it together, and what it had cost, and whether the cost had been worth it. He already knew the answer. He had always known the answer. The answer was sitting across from him rearranging napkins with the focused gravity of someone doing very important work. He thought about the photograph in the drawer. He thought about the man in that photograph, composed, focused, good at things that the current world had no use for and the past world had used too freely. He thought about whether that man had been wasted these past years or whether he had simply been redirected, put to use in a project that required different skills than the ones he'd been trained for. Patience, steadiness, presence, the ability to show up every day without applause and without acknowledgement, and do the thing that needed doing because it was the thing that needed doing. He decided, sitting at that table, that the man in the photograph had not been wasted. He had been deployed. Precisely, and to exactly the right place. And now the deployment was expanding, not replacing what it had been, not erasing the years of the mop and the cart and the freight elevator, but building on them. Because a man who has held his dignity through everything Marcus Reed had held it through does not become less when given more. He simply becomes more completely what he already was. As a cleaner in the Callaway building was a Tuesday in December, he told no one. He cleaned every floor with the same meticulous care he had brought to every shift for 4 months. Every corner, every baseboard, every place where the carpet met the marble threshold. He went through the executive corridor at 11:30. He mopped the length of it with deliberate, unhurried strokes. The yellow bucket beside him, the institutional gray polo shirt on his back for the last time. He did not linger. He did not perform a moment. He simply finished the work cleanly and well, the way he had always done. He rode the freight elevator down for the last time. He returned his cart and supplies to the service corridor. He badged out at 12:45 and walked through the lobby of Callaway Cosmetics, through the Italian marble and the crystal chandelier throwing light across every surface like scattered diamonds. And he walked out the front door, which he had never used before. He stood on the sidewalk in the cold December air, and he stood straight and still, and he looked up at the building for a moment, and then he turned and walked to his car. He did not look back. There was no need. A man who knows where he is going does not need to look back at where he has been. He had never been invisible. He had simply been unseen, which is a different thing entirely, and the error had always belonged to the people doing the looking, not the man standing in front of them. Marcus Reed had cleaned their floors and raised his son and endured their indifference and held his silence and kept his dignity intact through all of it. The way good men keep their dignity, not by declaring it, not by demanding it be recognized, but by simply never setting it down, no matter what they ask you to carry. That is what honor looks like, not in the moments of triumph, in the long, quiet, unwitnessed middle, in the service corridor, in the freight elevator, in the dark apartment at 6:15 in the morning with a boy who walks directly to his father, like a compass finding north. That is the whole of it. That has always been the whole of it. The following Monday, Marcus Reed arrived at Callaway Cosmetics at 8:45 in the morning, through the front door, in the dark charcoal suit. He took the main elevator to the 14th floor. He walked the length of the executive corridor with the unhurried, contained certainty of a man who has finally arrived in the place the geometry of his life had always been pointing toward, and who does not need to announce this to anyone. Because the way he walks through a room is announcement enough. His office was 3 doors down from Vivien Callaway's. It had a window that looked north, over the city. He stood at that window for a moment before sitting down, looking out at the November skyline, thinking about a 6-year-old boy who would be done with school at 2:45 and whom Marcus would pick up himself today. For the first time in months, because the new schedule allowed for it and he had arranged everything accordingly. He sat down at the desk. He opened the top drawer. He placed inside it one item, the small notebook where he tracked his monthly expenses, the one with the numbers that never quite added up to enough. He kept it there not because he needed it anymore, but because he wanted to remember, precisely without sentimentality, what the road had looked like, where he had started, what it had cost, what it had been worth. There was a knock at the door. He said, "Come in." It was Marion, who placed a folder on his desk with the efficiency of someone who had done this particular motion 10,000 times and who had decided, in the specific way that sharp people decide things about new colleagues, to extend a provisional trust. "First briefing is at 10, she said. "Security team is in the 3rd floor conference room. They're good people." She paused. "They were told about your background, most of them." Another pause. "The ones who were told are very pleased." She left. Marcus opened the folder. He began to read with the attentiveness of someone who does not need to be told twice about anything, who learns a system once and keeps it forever, who has always been, whatever the uniform, whatever the floor, whatever the title on the door or the absence of one, exactly and completely himself. The end. Some men spend their whole lives waiting for the world to see them clearly. Marcus Reed spent his life being exactly who he was, whether anyone was looking or not. And in the end, the way it always goes for men who refuse to be unmade by what they endure, the world caught up to him. It always does. Honor is not loud, it just lasts.